Hi there, I'm glad you're back. Today we're going to start working with the coping cutter, the raised panel cutter, and the sticking cutter. Now we're going to start with the sticking cutter, which may seem a bit out of order, but don't worry, I'll explain my rationale as we go along. So what did I get done since the last video? Well, I finished gluing up all of the book match panels. Then I trimmed them down to close, well, really close to the final size. These are actually about a ½ inch over in both dimensions. Now when trimming these down to size, I was very careful to keep the center, the glue line, in the center of the panel. I was also really careful to cut the top and bottom to frame what I wanted to see in the final panel. I've also cut all of the rail and stile parts to size. I'm using 2-inch wide rails and stiles for the doors. Now I'm going to make the drawer fronts just like the doors, except I'm going to use 1.5-inch wide rail and stile stock for those. I've also cut some additional pieces that we can use for setup at the router table, so I think we're pretty much ready to go. Let's get over to the router table and get started. The sticking cutter, or what some people refer to as the stile cutter, I actually like to say sticking cutter because this actually cuts the profile on both the rails and the stiles, the inside edge all the way around, and the groove for the panel. And of course it cuts upside down, so this is actually a mirror of what the profile will look like. But when it's upside down, it's mounted in here into the router table like this, and all of our pieces will be cut face down. Now, just like any other router bit, I like to push this down in the collet until it bottoms out, and then raise it up just a smidge off the bottom of the collet. Then we can tighten up the collet, and we're ready to start making adjustments and making test cuts. All right, so let's take a look at our profile. This is a very simple round over profile. This will be the top, what you see when you look at the door panel and the door, and this is where the panel will fit in. Now what we're seeking to do in setting up the sticking bit is we want to establish this inset to be essentially the same size as this shoulder. This is called the inset bead, and this is called the shoulder. And as you can see, this inset bead is too small and doesn't match this shoulder. So I have raised the bit, since we do these upside down, I've raised the bit to increase the size of the inset bead, and we're ready to run another test. Couple of things on the setup. There's a bearing in this bit. I just used the blade of my combination square to get that set perfectly even with the fence. And then the other thing that you want to do is if you have a fence that'll close in around this bit, you want to close it in as tight as you can without it making contact. Make sure it doesn't touch the fence anywhere. And then when you're all set up, you're ready to make a test. Now when we do our actual cuts, I will have hold downs holding these pieces of rail and stile stock down to the table and against the fence. But for now, I'm just going to use a handheld thing here to hold it because I'm only going part way in with the cut. So let me get my safety glasses on, get the dust collector turned on, and let's make a test cut. All right, that looks very, very close. Let's just take a look here. That's right at 1/8 of an inch. And that is just a smidge over an eighth, but I think we're close enough. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to cut a couple of full-length test cuts, and we're going to set those aside and use them in our setup later. And because these cuts are running with the grain, we don't have to worry about tear out at the end of the cut. Oh, that's going to be nice. We're going to cut one of our thin ones now, just to get a feel for what that's going to look like. And this will be on our drawer fronts. I think that's going to look real nice. All right, so we've got our samples cut of the sticking cut. And now what we want to do is we want to break this down and set up our coping cut. Now you're probably saying, Steve, you've got it all set up. Why don't you just go ahead and cut all these? Well, it is infinitely preferable to cut the coping cut first. But the reason I didn't set that up first is because I like to have a reference piece to use when I'm setting that up. So let's break this down and we'll get this set up. All right, now the coping cutter has a bearing located between two cutter sections. The top cutter section, which is cutting the bottom of our rails, is cutting the tenon. The tenon reaches all the way to the bearing, and then this bottom cutter, which is actually the top of the profile, cuts the other part of the tenon and cuts the roundover on the top so that it matches that that's on the rails and stiles on the edges. So what we need to do is we need to first get the height of this set. And because we've got to use a coping sled, I'm going to get the sled out and set it up here, and then we'll use one of our sample pieces to get the height dialed in close, and then we'll get it set perfectly. All right, so now with my coping sled up on top of the router table and one of our sample pieces that we cut before, all I need to do is put the sample piece on top of the coping sled and eyeball down here where the tenon is going to be cut and line it up with the groove in the piece that was cut before, and we should be definitely in the ballpark. And that looks pretty good. And after the height is roughly dialed in, we can set the coping sled aside for a couple of minutes, and we will get the bearing lined up with the front face of the fence. After we get the bearing lined up, we can bring this fence in a little tighter. Particularly important with these coping cuts. However, again, we'll make absolutely certain that the bit doesn't come in contact with the fence. And if you're sure the router is unplugged, just spin it around by hand. Make sure it's not. That looks pretty good. All right, so we're ready to make a test cut. Want to make sure the base of the coping sled clears the bit. And then we want to set this last fence with a scrap backup piece. So we're going to put in a scrap to prevent any tear out. We're going to put a simulated workpiece, another one of our scraps, in here. And then we'll move this fence back so that it's up against these two workpieces. And we're ready to go. Let's make a test cut. Well, after getting the coping cutter installed, bearing flush to the front of the fence, and getting the height roughly dialed in, I started making a test cut or two, and I quickly realized, much to my chagrin, that using the boards we had cut before as a test, the tenon was too loose in the groove. That just won't do. Now, fortunately, with this Freud router bit set, they give you this little handy-dandy spanner wrench that clips into two holes in the top of the bit. And then you use this included Allen wrench and loosen the screw in the top of the bit set. Then the top cutter will come completely off, and you can put spacers, washers, in there to effectively raise the height of this top cutter. And raising the height of that top cutter, net effect is that it makes the tenon thicker. Once I did that, I ran some more test cuts, and I got, oops, that's the wrong end, I got a nice fit, and that's exactly what you're looking for, is where it goes together smoothly, just a little bit of pressure, but then it holds together without any glue. That's just perfect. My height is pretty good, so we're ready to start making all of our coping cuts. We've got a lot of rails to cut, so let's get started. Now, normally I'm quite big on labeling everything so I don't get confused, but fortunately, these are pretty small doors and drawer fronts, and I've got room to lay everything out. So rather than labeling, I'm just going to be able to pick up a piece at a time, go to the router table, and do the work. Now, all of these are face up, matched up the way I want them. So all I've got to do is pick up a rail, turn it upside down, and go to the router table with it, and I'm good to go. I don't have to mark anything. Once the rails are cut, then it becomes pretty obvious what the next cuts need to be. So let's get rolling. In order to not lose your orientation, remember to just rotate these this direction, and then you'll keep the orientation correct for the other end. Make sure everything's snugged up to the fence, tighten down the top clamp, and do the other end. Now, I have found that these backer boards, even though you cut into the backup board, it'll be good for 4, 5, 6 cuts before you have to replace it. That looks pretty nice. Look at one of our, it's good we cut these test pieces ahead of time. That looks pretty good. Let's just keep on cutting. Rail, face down, into the coping sled, up to the fence, tighten down the clamp, ready to route. All right, well, I am finished with all of the coping cuts. Well, at least I'm pretty sure I'm finished. I'm going to go and double check and make sure every rail I need is cut and cut correctly. Trust me, if there's a way that you can mess this up, I've probably figured out how to do it in the past. I've cut a rail upside down. I've missed a cut on a rail. Just want to make sure you've got it all before you break this down and get ready to do the next operation. So the next step is we'll take the coping sled, put it away, and we're going to replace this with our sticking cutter and get that set up, and we'll be ready to go. All right, it's time for a test cut. Looks good. Let's see how it fits. Oh man, did I ever get lucky? Okay, all the door milling is done. Rails and stiles all done, and I've got all the doors and the drawer fronts put together, and it looks pretty good. Now, the next thing I want to do before we start cutting the raised panels is just to double check the dimensions to make sure that the door configurator has calculated it correctly. Now, I don't have one of those little tools that you can use to measure the inside measurements of things, but you don't really need it. I've got a couple of scraps of wood here, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to put one in here where it goes right up to the inside edge of the groove, and one on the other side doing the same thing, and then with them pushed up to both edges, I'll just hold them together and make a mark. Then with that mark on there, I can take these, line them up, and take a measurement. And we should be just a smidge over 8 1/4 because the panel is going to be 8 1/4, and that's right where we are. We're at 8 5/16. So we're perfect there. Okay, we've got our doors assembled, of course not glued up yet, but we've double checked now the interior dimensions between the grooves to make sure that the door configurator calculated the panel sizes correctly, and it did. So let's review just for a moment what we've done so far. We started by setting up the sticking cutter and getting the height adjusted so that the inset bead and the shoulder were close to the same size. And we also wanted to make sure it looked good. Then we cut a couple of full-length tests to use later for setup. Then we removed the sticking cutter and installed the coping bit. You always want to cut the coping cuts on the rails first, because that way you can just use square-shaped stock for backer boards to avoid blowout on the rear of the cut. If we cut all the sticking cuts first, we'd actually have to have backer boards with a profile milled into it. That's a lot of trouble. After we cut all the coping cuts in the ends of the rails, we put the sticking bit back into the router table. Now this time setting the height was really easy. We could use one of these test boards we cut earlier and get that to get the initial height set. Then all we had to do was make a couple of tweaks and get it perfect. And what do I mean by perfect? Well, this is what you're looking for. you really want to have absolutely no ridge, perfectly flat here where the cope and stick join together. Well, now it's time to make the raised panels. We're going to use this raised panel cutter that came with the Freud router bit set. So if you're ready, click on part B of this video and we'll get going.